I am an urban sociologist, I'm not a lawyer. What's an urban sociologist? It's, I guess, we're interested in how the city shapes us and how we shape the city. And today I want to talk about not so much all cities, but I want to focus on cities in the global south, and particularly megacities. And I'll use the example of Dhaka in Bangladesh, where I and a couple of my PhD students have been carrying out research for the last few years. So I'd like to acknowledge my PhD students, Kazi Fatah and Lutfun Lata. I'll be drawing on a lot of the ideas that they've come up with in their thesis work. The reason I guess we can use megacities as an example is because they tend to be, a lot of the lessons in a megacity, a city of over 10 million people, can be generalised to others in the global south. They tend to be more like each other than they are to their hinterlands. I can see it up there. So, I'm looking at this one, Sustainable Development Goal number 11. I won't tell you what's in it until the end. What I want to do is present some of the challenges that these cities face, and you'll see when I'm finished how the Sustainable Development Goals sort of match up with that quite nicely, and you'll be able to make your own minds up about whether these goals are achievable by 2030. Half the world's population live in cities. In fact, I think it's about 60% now, and that number is only going to grow. Almost all the world's population growth this century will be urban, and a lot of that population growth was sort of intrinsic to the cities themselves, but it's also part of a massive migration happening all over the world from rural to urban living, and that's got to do with poverty, it's got to do with war, it's got to do with the mechanisation and technological innovations in the countryside as well. Almost all of this growth will be in the global south, and most of this growth, or a large proportion of this growth, will be into megacities, cities of more than 10 million people. We're going to deal with Dhaka today, which has a population of 16 million thereabouts. But if any of you have been to Lagos or Jakarta or Manila or Calcutta or Mumbai, you will have been to a global megacity, Sao Paulo, in South America. It depends how you count the population in these cities. The biggest in the world has been Tokyo, or the metropolitan area of Tokyo, for a long time now. The second biggest, according to a lot of counts now, is Jakarta, which not many people realise. It's right on our doorstep. The population of Greater Jakarta now is about 27 million people. So, in these cities, 1 billion people live in slums. Okay, that's a conservative estimate, and of those 1 billion, a significant proportion would qualify for absolute poverty or would have to survive on around $1.90 US a day or less. And most of these people live and work in the informal economy. Despite this growth in urban population and this growth in the urban poor, a lot of the world's development effort is still rural. Development agencies are really taking their time in catching up on the urban phenomenon, and not just the location of development efforts, but also the methods are very rural. And this is causing problems for cities, because people don't live in cities in the same way that they do in the countryside. There's little incentive for people to move back from cities to the countryside. Usually when they arrive in a megacity, they stay there because poverty is generally much worse in the countryside than it is in the city. It's often without hope, where at least there is some glimmer of hope in the cities. The informal economy is probably the most important aspect of the challenge that face megacities in the global south. It's unregulated and untaxed. That's kind of the definition of an informal economy, is economic activity that happens outside the regulatory framework of the nation state, and it's also untaxed. It's generally exploitative. Workers in the informal economy generally have no bargaining power. Child labour is rife. It's almost normalised in Bangladesh. when you reach a certain level of poverty, you take your children out of school and send them to work, which keeps the family going. Workplace safety, of course, is non-existent, and it's also environmentally destructive. It's not open to the same sort of regulatory basis, environmental regulations and work safety and toxic spills into rivers and all those sorts of things. And additionally, people who live and work in the informal economy, people who live in informal settlements or slums, are often seen, particularly in Bangladesh, as non-citizens. They're seen as a problem. The city governments and national governments don't actually want them there. They'll prefer them to go away. So often they're ignored or worse by the national government. They're not really a focus of development. So what does the unplanned city look like? A lot like that, actually. Unchecked urban sprawl, okay, almost no zoning. People establish settlements wherever they can, usually on government or non-used private land. Public space is very contested. Public space is often the only place where street vendors and other hawkers and people who need to earn an income, like selling things, can work and operate. Governments would often would like to see public space empty, nice and clean and green, and workers who work in public space are often extorted or exploited by sort of low-level government officials and the police force and those sort of people. So they're paying rent, extortion money, to these low-level actors to remain in public space and to earn a living. Waste management is a massive problem. I don't know if anyone's been to Jakarta, but Jakarta, something like only 15% of the waste generated in Jakarta every day is actually collected, and the rest goes into drains and rivers and those sorts of things. It's a similar case in Dhaka. Air and water pollution, very little regulation on people burning fires, on public transport, on taxis, on things like that, and also the toxic outflow of unregulated industry. Very susceptible to disasters. Bangladesh is at real risk from climate change. Already in the south of the country, there's massive desalination or salination of land, which has exacerbated the sort of rural to urban migration to Dhaka. Every time there's a big monsoon or a flood, more and more of the rivers fall into, more and more of the land falls into the rivers, and Dhaka itself is mainly built on a floodplain, and it's usually the poorest who live in the lowest areas. And that's getting worse. Health, these are the sort of outcomes of, I guess, of informality and lack of acknowledgement by the government. Things like health and education and other forms of social welfare are generally sort of very piecemeal, are the responsibility of NGOs rather than the government. So there's little access to clinics, hospitals, trained health professionals. When there is, it's normally, as I say, an NGO. Infant mortality is still very high in the cities, probably not as high as the rural areas. And of course, communicable diseases, particularly waterborne communicable diseases, are rife in informal settlements. Definition of a slum, by the way, is a housing settlement without tenure, okay, without any guarantee of continuing tenure, lack of access to government services, lack of access to utilities like electricity and water, and the last one is hygiene, sanitation, okay, toilets. And poor nutrition. Food is generally of a poor quality by the time it gets to people in the slums. Education, there's little access to basic schooling. The problems being child labour, as well as sort of lack of access to reasonable sort of level of state schooling. It's often a very low quality. Illiteracy is still a big problem in Bangladesh and other similar countries. Girls in particular are disadvantaged. Girls are often taken out of school before boys in societies like Bangladesh's. And also, in some contexts, not just Bangladesh, there is an opportunity for religious radicalisation, which comes from poverty and a lack of sort of formal or state-sponsored education. Radical religious organisations often see it as a good opportunity to come and start sort of shaping, I guess, young people's minds. Environmentally, toxic emissions and industrial waste. This problem with waste disposal. Air quality is often really bad, and so is water quality, particularly drinking water. So in general, public health is, I guess, a challenge. Employment is uncertain, sporadic, dangerous, and very low paid, and usually casual, usually on a as-needed basis by an employer. Workers are subject to abuse, to nepotism, and sometimes to slavery. I've spoken about child labour. All these photos, by the way, are from Dhaka, from photos we've taken on our trips over there. Public space, once again, is an issue for employment, and particularly for women. A lot of households, a larger than average number of households in informal settlements in Dhaka are headed by women. Husbands have either died early or abandoned the family for whatever reason. Women tend to be not welcome in public space for cultural reasons, tend to be looked down upon if they're out in public space selling things. So this is a problem as well, equity for sort of income generation, particularly when the family's headed by a woman. And the urban poor are also susceptible to technological advances. Despite Dhaka's poverty, there is a growing middle class and a growing elite, and things like shopping malls and supermarkets and better highways and all those sorts of things sort of all take away employment opportunities for the urban poor. This is often exacerbated by the trade regimes that we have operating around the world, which I'm sure you're aware of. This is a picture I took about a week after the collapse of the garment factory at Rana Plaza a few years ago, where hundreds of mainly women workers, garment workers, were trapped and killed. And these signs are asking the government to respond to their pleas, A, to find their loved ones, and B, for compensation or for someone to take responsibility for this disaster. Okay, sweatshops. Bangladesh is an increasingly popular place for international clothing brands for its cheap labour. Okay, so why is it like this? Well, it's a very complex set of reasons, and they're not recent reasons either. They go right back to colonial times. The way that cities are governed, particularly cities in the former colonies of Britain, are still governed in many ways like they were by the British colonial masters. People are sort of relegated to slums, to informal settlements, and are expected to be almost self-governing unless they create trouble, like protest, for example. As a result, there are cultures of entitlement for the rich and the powerful and the well-connected, and a certain sense of fatalism for the urban poor. The urban poor, when they come into the city, they tend to sort of congregate with their kinship groups from rural Bangladesh, and opportunities to build social capital, or bridging social capital as we call it, are very limited. So people, even though they're in the city, the opportunities are still very limited to sort of small kinship groups. And as a result, the urban poor are very atomised. There's no sort of collectivity or sort of collective outrage. So that's what I mean when I say cultures of entitlement and fatalism. There's widespread corruption and nepotism. That's not news, but a lot of aid money and a lot of what could be spent on the urban poor is redirected in other directions. And of course, globalisation and trade regimes are still very inequitable. None of this is sort of news. There is a concept we call right to the city, which is a very old concept. It goes back 20 or 30 years. And what it does is say that, you know, if you live in a city, regardless of whether you own property or not, you should have access to these things as a matter of course, okay? And they sort of align very nicely with, I'll read them for you. This is a slide fail. So safe water, safe regular electricity, transport systems for all, sustainable human settlement planning, safeguards of cultural and natural settings, disaster resilience, air quality, waste management, better access to public space, support of economic and social environmental links between urban, peri-urban and rural, okay? Integrated policies and plans, and sustainable and resilient buildings. Really, I've pretty much covered all of those things, and I actually wrote the slides before I even looked at that. So they kind of match up pretty nicely. They're pretty obvious. I don't know whether it's a problem that can be solved simply by 2030. Apart from the below the sea one, I think it's the only spatial problem in the Sustainable Development Goals. That's it. That's it from me. Thank you very much.